welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I am so glad that you have come along. Thanks for checking this out. And if you have enjoyed past episodes of the More to the Story podcast, I would love it if you would write a review for us on Apple Podcasts or share a link with friends, share on social media, subscribe on YouTube, however you're getting this. That just helps the content that we're producing get a further audience. I don't know how all those algorithms work online, but they say that makes a difference. So I encourage you to check that out. And we have a great episode today with a new friend of mine, and I'm going to introduce him here just in a second. But those of you who are interested in the Wesleyan holiness tradition are going to be fascinated. I'm telling you, fascinated by this subject today. But first, we want you to know that today's podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. We do that through a variety of programs. And actually, in September, there's something very important starting called the Wesley Institute. It's a program for lay people, 9-month program that there's two versions. There is a Bible track and a theology track. And we walk through every book of the Bible in the Bible track, and we have seminary professors teaching on all of those sessions. And then there's a theology track on a similar type of trajectory. So we'd love for you to check that out at wbs.edu. Also, this podcast is brought to you by WPO Development. Their CEO, Keith Waters, has helped more than 250 organizations around the country with mission planning studies, feasibility studies, and capital campaigns. They do a great job coming alongside of people, helping them kind of develop a vision, know where they're going, and it helps them get there. So you can find information about WPO development in the show notes. And finally, I want to make sure you know that this fall, as you're kind of getting together your resources, maybe for a Sunday school class or for a small group curriculum, I have just released a new study of the book of Jude. It's 6 sessions, 5 hours of content that's designed for small groups and Sunday school classes with a discussion guide, discussion forum, experts talking on this on certain areas and walking through this powerful little book that calls us to contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. And so you can check that out on my website at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. All right. I am excited to welcome into the podcast, the More to Story podcast, Dr. Luther Oconer, who serves as the Global Wesleyan Theology Professor at Asbury Theological Seminary, particularly in Asbury Global, which means that it's a campus that's connected to not just their campus in Wilmore, but all of their extension sites around the country and maybe at some point around the world. Luther, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Thanks for having me in this famous podcast of yours. So I'm glad to be here and with with our conversation, particularly on the topic that you've asked me to talk about.
Yeah, we're going to get there. Just say, before we do that, I mean, I've been so impressed and thankful for we've just known each other even in this year. We served on a committee together at the Faith Once for All Delivered, where the Next Methodism concept, that was a really exciting thing. And then we were at a conference together where we were both speaking. And I'm just like, I'm like, man, how did I not know this guy sooner? So I'm really thankful to get a chance to share in yours. But tell some folks just briefly about you and how God's been at work in your life and even your calling to serve as a professor and scholar.
Yes, I'm currently a professor at the Asbury Theological Seminary. I just joined the faculty just last year. So this is my 10th year of teaching in this, as a ministry. But prior to that, I've been at United Theological Seminary for 9 years in Dayton, Ohio. And in fact, I just moved here in the Orlando area just last month. So we still have boxes to unpack.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm originally from the Philippines. I was born and raised there, and moved to this country in 2001 when I did my master's at the university, and then moved on. Yeah, Drew. Yeah, in Madison, New Jersey, and then went on to do my PhD there.
Did you work with Tom Oden there?
No, he was already on the way out when I got there. But I got to work with a number of amazing people in the Wesleyan Studies, what do you call that, cohort at Drew. Yes. And so it's been a great journey to to learn more about Methodism while I was there, and even to know more about my own heritage as a Methodist from the Philippines.
Yes, this is
As
so
I yes
interesting.
yes as I did my dissertation particularly on that subject matter.
Okay,
Yeah.
so was it connected to Methodism or even the Holiness movement or
Yeah, it's
both?
it's
Yeah.
sort of the intersection between Methodism,
Okay.
the manifestations of the Holiness movement in mission history,
Yes.
and a little bit of an intersection with Pentecostalism, Pentecostal
Gotcha.
history. So we have those three going on in my study.
Now, a lot of people know, like I've had some people on my podcast that talk
Mhm,
about what's
mhm.
going on in Methodism. So I had Keith Boyette from the
Yeah.
WCA.
Mhm.
Recently, I had Rob Renfro on with Good News. And there's a significance of what's called within United Methodism, the Central Conference. Were you a part of the United Methodist Church or just a branch of Methodism?
I'm still
Philippines?
part of the United Methodist Church.
Okay.
I'm an ordained elder
Okay.
in the Philippines, because in the Philippines we did not become autonomous. So we're
Okay.
still part of the United Methodist Church connection and under the Philippine Central Conference.
Okay.
Uh,
Gotcha.
yeah. So it started in 18, at least the Methodist Episcopal Church came to the Philippines late 1898, early 1899. And that's where Methodism started there. And now
Gotcha.
we're like, I think 26 annual conferences all over the country, and 300,000 plus United Methodists in
Wow.
the
Do you all hear
Philippines.
that?
Yeah.
300,000 plus United Methodists in the Philippines.
Yes.
Wow. That is amazing. And so
Mm.
there's a whole system of probably seminaries and schools. And isn't
Yes.
there even an Asbury College in the Philippines?
Yes, there is
Yeah.
one, but no connections with
Right.
with the Asbury in Wilmer, Kentucky.
Yeah.
It's just I guess just named after Asbury to
Yeah.
begin
Yeah.
with, and then a whole number of probably about a dozen colleges, or
Wow.
maybe less than a dozen colleges all over the country, uh, and plenty of kindergarten schools.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow, who'd have
Mhm.
now? Okay, this is I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question. So tell me a little bit, like as you've come to the United States and spent
Mhm.
10 years here or longer, 10 years
Yeah,
teaching
20
and
years plus. Yeah,
20 years. Wow.
yeah.
So tell me about the compare and contrast Methodism between the two
Oh,
in the
that's an
Philippines.
interesting question, because I got to encounter that just right off the bat. But so to speak, fresh off the boat.
Okay.
When I first came in, this was a week before 9/11, and
Oh wow.
a week or 2 weeks before that, and so the first Sunday I went to a United Methodist church, which was nearby the campus at Drew. And of course, naturally, because I'm United Methodist, I would go to a United Methodist church. And
Right.
so I went there, attended, and lo and behold, the pastor had a doctorate, PhD degree. But as I was, as he was speaking, I was kind of, I was already noticing the differences
Wow.
with the
Yeah.
way he preached the message, and it felt like, I felt like an alien
Wow.
in that church. I didn't know whether I was in a Methodist church or not.
Right.
And nobody greeted me. Nobody said hi to me. I went in and I went out, and that was it. But I never came back.
Wow.
Uh, and then and then a week later, I got in touch with the pastor of the Vineyard Church
Okay.
on
Interesting.
campus, and he came and picked me up. And then from then on, I started attending a Vineyard Church
Okay.
because I felt much more at home.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
with the type of worship that they had at the Vineyard Church. That's the spirituality, the warmth. I felt much more of a connection there
Wow.
than with the United Methodist Church that I went to. Um,
Gotcha.
yeah, and so that's, I was there in that Vineyard Church for probably about 7 years. Um,
Okay.
but almost in and out because I was also serving another church.
Okay.
A non-denominational church later on as a youth pastor.
Okay.
But always been connected with that vineyard church more than I was connected with the United Methodist Church.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
Like,
that's irony. Yeah.
as I visited, as we've come to the Jackson area, visiting other churches to see what's going on, I've been interested. Like one of the most Wesleyan messages that I've heard has come at a charismatic church.
Oh yeah.
So
Yes.
it's
Yes.
interesting, like to be truly connected to the identity of the movement. It might
Mhm.
need to be something that is outside of the institutions of the movement
Yes.
sometimes.
Yes, exactly. And that kind of made me realize that in the United Methodist Church in the Philippines, we were more charismatic.
Okay.
We were more charismatic, Pentecostal leaning than United Methodists in the U.S.
Yeah.
But of course, as my knowledge of the United Methodist Church in the U.S. kind of expanded and met more people, I realized that there were pockets
Yes.
of charismatic expressions all throughout United Methodism in the U.S. And so it just so happened that the ones that I've encountered while I was in New Jersey weren't like that. Um,
Yeah.
and then when we
Now, when you
moved
say
to
charismatic, you
yes,
mean do we mean like emphasizing healing, speaking in tongues, or just kind of an awareness of the spirit,
yes,
or
more
all
of
of
the
the above?
awareness of the spirit and the worship style, particularly with
Yeah.
praise and worship music, and of course the language of the spirit. At least in the language of the church, you can hear people talking about the Holy Spirit, the spirit-filled life. So we get that a lot in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And partly because of that history as well, which I'm gonna probably, get a chance to talk more about
Yeah, exactly.
in
So
this
this
episode.
fits in with your research. So
Yes.
that's what I love. I
Hmm.
love it when our research interests, our writing, our preaching truly is connected to our life. Now, before we go too much further, I do want to mention I'm not seeing your screen. I don't know
Yeah.
if your screen is frozen, but which might be okay. And people on YouTube, you might just have to deal with me if you're looking for a movement. But yeah, let's try and start it. There we
Okay.
go.
There you
I
go.
got you again.
Okay. Cool.
So good.
Cool.
Okay, so this is interesting. So your dissertation was on holiness, the holiness movement in the Philippines. But
Yes.
that then gave you an avenue to
Hmm.
think of a very particular event of a key holiness movement leader, Henry Clay Morrison,
Exactly. Yeah.
who is the founder of Asbury Seminary. Fascinating
Hmm.
that you're there, of course. And then also was the president of Asbury College at that time. But
Yeah.
people might not know. They might know him for that. But this is a gigantic figurehead,
Yeah.
spokesperson of this theological perspective, and
Mm.
united that perspective behind a magazine called the Pentecostal Herald. But
Yeah.
you found something very interesting about and I had heard about this
Hmm.
about his world tour of evangelism. But talk to me about what has interested you in that tour.
Yeah, because first and foremost, it's because it's something that kind of I've during my research for my dissertation,
Yeah.
I've kind of briefly intersected with that with Henry Clay Morrison, particularly his tour, because he went to the Philippines as part of that
Yes.
tour, but he was in the Philippines for only a few days, but his visit there made quite a dent, quite an impact
Yes.
in Methodism in the Philippines. Historians would say one of our foremost historian in Methodism in the Philippines, the first Filipino Methodist bishop. I would make his name is Dionisio Alejandro. He went to Asbury as well. He made the claim that um, that Morrison's visit in the Philippines, among the Methodists in the Philippines, made holiness the birthright
Wow.
of Filipino Methodists. It started a whole new spiritual culture in the
Wow.
Philippines that lasted until World War Second and beyond.
Okay.
And so that's what kind of caught my attention. So that's why I look into that. Uh, and and later on, there was this opportunity at a conference, well, actually at AAR, to
Okay.
present something on the intersections between the Holiness movement and Pentecostalism. That's when I started to look more deeply into Morrison's world tour of evangelism, which kind of allowed me to see much more of that, to see where he went, the different countries he went to, how he ministered, the message he preached, and its impact in those different countries that he went to within a span of 11 months.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's
And
quite
he went to
amazing.
now you highlight that it's
Yeah.
not properly a world tour because he
Yes.
didn't go.
No, he
He
didn't.
didn't like travel the world. Where did
No.
he go to, Luther?
Yes, first he went to England, and basically just did a touristy stop,
Yeah.
like a pilgrimage stop of Methodist sites in
It
England.
might as well.
Yeah, he might as well do that. And then he went to Palestine, the Holy Land, and again did touristy stuff. But really, those were just a segue for him to go into India.
Right.
So because in India, Methodism had quite a big presence there.
What year was
Particularly,
this?
this
What year
was in
he?
1910.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
Sorry for interrupting you.
yeah. He left the U.S. in July 1909, and then he came back in around June. June 1910. Yeah. So, but anyway, he got into India and spent I think about 5 weeks in India, particularly in the mission stations of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And then after that, went to Rangoon, that is Burma or Myanmar today,
Right.
and then Singapore, the Philippines, and then went to China. He went to Japan, and then Korea.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And what's interesting is, he didn't just go to visit missionaries from the Methodist Episcopal Church. He went to see missionaries from the Methodist Episcopal Church South, particularly when he was in Korea. He also went and ministered to missionary, within the Free Methodist Church as well. YMCA and what else? And OMS, the Oriental Missionary Society. Well, these are all, some of them are what we would call today mainline churches. Some,
Right.
Some would become like the OMS. It was a missionary organization in the radical holiness sense. But what kind of this shows us is the holiness movement was kind of present in different denominations at that time.
Yes.
I always put it this way: it's kind of like the charismatic movement today. There's no particular
Yes.
denomination that claims ownership to it, but it just kind of, it's just kind of integrally operating within outside denominational lines.
Right. They
And
even resisted it, didn't they? I mean,
yes,
this is early
yes,
Pentecostalism.
yes.
And it's interesting too that they think that this,
Mm.
and this is so connected.
Mhm.
Morrison's periodical is called the Pentecostal Herald.
Exactly.
The founder of my movement in the Wesleyan
Yeah.
tradition, the Salvation Army, is famous for a song singing, "We want another Pentecost," right?
Yes,
There's like
exactly.
this, and also this move away
Mhm.
from denomination, not thinking
Yes.
of themselves as
Yes.
denominations, though sociologically, clearly
Yeah.
they are functioning as a denomination.
Yeah, because today when we say Pentecostal, people see it or understand it to mean the Pentecostal movement, or at least the modern Pentecostal movement that started in 1906 out of the Azusa revival in Los Angeles. But what people don't know is that this Pentecostal movement is much more earlier than that. It's probably a byproduct of the holiness movement.
Yes.
Particularly in the 1890s, when there was a shift in the way the holiness movement articulated the doctrine of holiness, and they began to equate it with the baptism of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
So the teachings on holiness, which is really what we would call in Methodism the grand depositum of Methodism, has taken more Pentecostal motif.
Right.
In the way people explained it, they explained it more in the vein of, you know, the language found in the book of Acts.
Right.
And so people started equating it, you know, especially the experience of entire sanctification. It was equated with the experience of the spirit-filled life or the baptism of the Holy Ghost.
Right.
And so you would see a lot of holiness folks started talking about entire sanctification that way. Uh, and so that's why it's no accident. For example, in the case of Morrison and others, at least in the Methodist tradition, they would have what they would call Pentecostal meetings. These were revival meetings that they would hold, and they would call them Pentecostal because the main message was for people to experience the Pentecostal blessing.
Yes.
And when they say Pentecostal blessing, what they really mean is entire sanctification,
Right.
plus a manifestation of power, you know, for mission or ministry. So you see those themes kind of become quite dominant in the 1890s. And so the fact that Morrison changed the name of the paper, his paper, I think Methodist or Old Methodist to Pentecostal Herald,
Right.
seems to, or at least illustrates the fact that there was the shift within the Holiness movement towards that, what I would call Pentecostalized holiness, and so that's why you know, that was the dominant theme that you will find in the Holiness movement, and it manifested among the missionaries who went to the mission field in different denominations. They all, you know, they were deeply influenced by the Holiness movement, particularly through Holiness revivals, because, you know, most of them got their call to the mission field in a revival.
Yes.
In a revival meeting. They experience, you know, the Pentecostal blessing. And so it's, you know, it's not an accident to see the accounts. At least if you look at their diaries, their journal reports, there's a lot of that language going on. Them talking about the baptism of the Holy Ghost, talking about the spirit-filled life. And it's all because of that influence.
Yes.
And you find across the board from folks from different denominations. Sometimes it's hard to make the distinction, you know, among these folks. But really, if you look at them, they're just reading the same books. They're just, you know,
Right. It's interesting. It's a
Yeah,
pan West. We are
Yeah.
popularly saying now
Mhm.
pan Wesleyanism, particularly with
Mm.
United Methodism, quite frankly, falling apart and becoming
Yeah.
something new. So
Yeah.
there are United Methodist churches that are becoming Free Methodists, some
Mhm.
Global Methodist, and so we're thinking, like, so for instance, I had your colleague, my friend Jonathan Powers, come on and
Yes.
talk about the new pan Wesleyan hymnal. But Henry Clay Morrison was doing all of this
Yes.
through
Exactly.
the Pentecostal Herald, which, by the way,
Yes.
I always find it interesting that there's still a remnant of the Herald. Well, after I studied, not to the same extent you have, but studying Morrison myself, I
Mhm.
realized that the Asbury Seminary magazine is called the Herald. And
Yes.
it's
Yes.
the remnant kind of
The remnant
the
of that. Yeah.
Pentecostal Herald. So I think
Hmm.
that's interesting. But nevertheless, like, what it was that united it was Morrison's movement. I mean, I wouldn't say it's his movement, right?
Yeah.
Of course, and theologically, I want to think of it as the work of the Spirit, like
Yeah.
it's God's work, is what God wants to see happen in the world. At the same time, the role of the institution is interesting
Yes.
because it wasn't an institution uniting these groups globally.
Mhm. Yeah.
It was Morrison's paper.
Yes.
Am I wrong
Exactly.
in that?
Yeah, I think you're correct. And it's not just Morrison's paper. There were a number of papers as well. You know, the homeless movement was quite huge during that time, and there were a number of folks, you know, doing their own thing, publishing their own papers. And Morrison seems, Pentecostal Herald was, you know, probably would be on the top level or top tier
Right.
of all those papers, because it's, you know, because of his. I would say, you know, he was more ecumenical. At least in that point, because he just kind of, I mean, and his world tour of evangelism illustrates that, because he just went from one denomination to another, very much welcome, you know,
Yes.
And because of that, it kind of illustrates its influence, and popularity,
Yes.
within the pan-Wesleyan, connection, of that time. And
Yeah.
also because I think the message, people
Amen.
just resonated with the message. And so it's easy, for him to just kind of crisscross from one boundary to another.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
let me pause this. I want to get back to the historical piece, and that's really
Yes.
important.
Hmm.
But there's also, I think you and I get excited about
Hmm.
this because
Yes.
it's like reality.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
like there might have been some problems
Hmm.
in the holiness movement of that time. But
Hmm.
tell me about your own experience with this, like this type of Pentecostal blessing. And
Yeah.
if we can
Exactly. Yeah.
pause a biographical,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
why does this matter to you?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question because, people would say when I was a Drew, they would tell us, dissertations are really biographical. And that's
Mm,
really true for myself, because
okay.
my dissertation was really connected to my own experience, to my own quest to understand Methodism,
Mm,
in the Philippines, and particularly to the lens of my own experience. Because way back in 1997, that was the year when I entered the ministry, when I decided, I was an engineer at that time. I was a
okay.
junior engineer working for a up and rising, telecommunications company in Manila,
Okay.
and I was working there for 3 years in that field. And lo and behold, I got an experience of what I would call a baptism of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
This was at an event called Aldersgate,
Oh,
youth conference.
wow. Great.
So this was the beginning, of a charismatic movement in the Methodist Church in the Philippines. Probably it
Okay.
started about 1994, but then started to just kind of explode, and reach the young people. And so this was a gathering of young people, United Methodist young people, about 800 of us, in a place called Baguio City in the Philippines. And I was there, at the time where I was going through my own spiritual crisis,
Okay.
because I felt that, once I began entering the field of engineering, working in the telecoms firm, I found myself becoming less Christian, and,
Interesting.
and kind of turning away from the faith in a way, because I became so busy and fixated on success, career. But then I just saw that, having having a toll on my own walk with God, my own spirituality, and it's been manifesting in my life. And I didn't want it. I didn't like it. And so, I got to a point where, I felt like I was at the back of the wall, and with nowhere else to go. And I said, when I heard that there was this gathering of young people, in this Aldersgate event, I said, I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna tell my boss I'm gonna go there, and he better allow me to get it, because I'm about to die, so to speak.
Wow.
And so lo and behold, I got to that event, and just the first night, boom, you know,
Hmm.
experienced something, that was kind of out of the, ordinary, at least in the matter of this sense. I found myself on the floor, and then I started laughing on the floor.
Interesting. Just like there.
Yeah, I just felt this waves upon waves of this divine presence.
Yeah.
That then I started laughing. Actually, when they told me I was the first person to do that in that event. But it was just waves upon waves, and I was there for
Yeah.
more than an hour,
Wow.
laughing, crying, and it was amazing. I felt like I was in heaven.
Wow.
But then one thing led to another in that event, that it became clear to me, that I was not where God wanted me.
Yeah.
And because prior to that, even as early as when I was in elementary and high school, people were already telling me I was going to become a pastor.
Mm.
I already had that call to ministry, but
Yeah.
then after finishing college, I ran away from it. I ran away from the call, and so
Yeah.
so basically this event made it clear to me that I was called to the ministry.
Yeah.
So it made God real to me, so real to me that there was no way I was gonna go home and not be changed by the experience. And so there and right there and there, the Lord impressed in my heart that I should fulfill my promise.
Wow.
And so I did. And there made the result that I'm gonna quit my job. And after that, return back to Manila. And first day back at work, I spoke to my boss and told him I'm gonna quit.
Wow.
And I was gonna become a pastor. And so I did. And there were a number of young people who did the same. It, we're talking about the United Methodist Church. And so in the Philippines, when you say you want to become a pastor, they appoint you right away to a church. You get
Okay.
So a few months later, this was February 1997. By June, I was pastoring a church. And even that church was prophesied in that event that I will be in this church, the same church.
Wow.
It was a church by the highway, and I was in a church by the highway. Exactly as
Amazing.
yes, as revealed. And so I was there. But then, of course, given my experience, this charismatic experience, not naturally, I would carry that with me. And that caused a lot of problems for me. In my church, it was awesome because the church went through a period of revival. We became more Pentecostal than a nearby Assembly of God church. And this was a United Methodist church. But then, older pastors within the district, in my district, started noticing, and that's when the persecution started. They started sending folks to kind of look at me or kind of look on me and sort of kind of spy on me, so to speak. And then that would eventually get me in trouble.
Wow.
Later on, after a year, and because I became so identified as a Pentecostal, and I was told that that's not allowed in the United Methodist Church. It got to a point that I was I got me and two other pastors. We were we got we were put in a meeting with our DCOM, what we call District Committee on Ministries, and they recommended that they would charge us with a chargeable offense in our book of discipline for the dissemination of doctrines contrary to the doctrines of the United Methodist Church because of our Pentecostalism. That's basically what it is. And so I asked them, what did we do that's not compatible with the doctrines of the Methodist Church, or the UMC, and they couldn't tell me anything. Wow. But all they knew was, what we're doing was not Methodist. And so that's kind of signaled for me the beginning of. By the way, nothing happened to us, even though they recommend us to be charged. The bishop eventually reversed that. Come annual conference, and it didn't happen. But it kind of marked for me the beginning of a search to kind of find out more about my heritage as a Methodist and to understand my experience and say, because I began to do research about Methodism in England and saw all of these accounts of revivals during the time of Wesley, and then American Methodism, and so that kind of led me to I wanted to study more. And so I said, okay, what I'll do is probably I need to go to the US and get to the bottom of this and learn more about Wesley, learn more about Methodism. And so I did. The year after that, I was a Drew. Not a year after that. I went to seminary first, and then after graduating at seminary in the Philippines, I went to Drew. And with the intent of being there for a master's only for a year or two.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and then lo and behold, God opened the doors for me to move into the PhD program at Drew, and my research question was, okay, if there was this powerful revival during the time of Wesley, and then in American Methodism, and then so my question was there anything like that in the Methodist Church in the Philippines in its early history? And so that's what led me to this, basically, to this research.
Yes.
And so that led me to know more about the holiness movement. Because what was the main thing that was happening during that period when the missionaries came to the Philippines? What was the main thing? When I realized it was the holiness movement.
Yes.
That was really the thing. And so that led me to learn more about that and its intersection with Pentecostalism. And then when I look at the because I was there at Drew, that's where the United Methodist Church archives is
Right.
located.
Right. Yeah.
And so all of the missionary, all of the journals, conference journals in the Philippines can be found there. You have the missionary, uh, the missionary archival missionary materials, their journals, their diaries. So I was able to piece together all of this narrative
Interesting.
and found that, you know, I realized that as I was looking at the accounts, I realized that yes, we did have the same thing in the Philippines.
It's amazing.
In the Methodist Church, and they were having what they would call Pentecostal meetings, or in Tagalog, they would call it Culto Pentecostal. And there were a lot of powerful accounts. And it was not just a footnote in the history. It was common. It was mainstream. They do it every summer.
Yes.
But then I realized that the best way to understand Methodism in the Philippines is through the lens of holiness revivals, because it can, if you look at through that lens, you'll be able to understand all of the major events that happened in its history. It's almost somewhat connected to all of these main events that we've known for so long in the Philippines. But there's no one has attempted to do it, to use an interpretative lens to study them. And so now I got this tool, the holiness revivals, as my interpretative lens to understand the history better. And so that was my dissertation. I think that became a book.
I loved it. The autobiographical and how it blends with your own personal experience. And that's why I felt led to do it. I mean, I kind of felt like, as I was even asking you a question, like, should I say this? Because it's kind of like, but it blends so well with something that is true and real. And that's what we emphasize here at Wesley Biblical Seminary is actually it's in our faculty manual that once a semester, every professor will testify to God's Spirit's work in their life, the role of sanctifying grace and how God is progressively sanctifying us and how that comes in specific moments of crisis. And then to call upon students to, as John Wesley says in Scripture Way of Salvation, seek it now. And so that's a requirement as me as a dean to make sure that happens. And, and not that it has to like be a turnkey result, but we emphasize the role of story, and that then leads amazingly to discovering more in our research. Now, one thing I found helpful with your paper, and this comes out in a book on holiness and Pentecostal studies, edited by David Bundy and Jordan Hammond. And I am fascinated by the distinctions you make, and a lot of people don't get this between the Keswick holiness movement, the radical holiness movement, and the Wesleyan holiness movement. So can you help me understand those distinctions?
Yes. Let's begin with the Wesleyan holiness movement, or this Wesleyan holiness expression. That would be the classic Wesley understanding. We would usually call eradicationist, because in Wesley we find this, in this understanding of holiness, at least when it talks about entire sanctification, of the possibility of the eradication of the sinful nature.
Right.
And so what we see in Wesley is this optimism of grace, the possibility that the sinful nature can be totally overcome. Again, partly because of his pneumatology. His soteriology, his understanding of salvation, is closely linked to his understanding of the work of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
And so I think that kind of gives, helps us distinguish Methodism from Pentecostalism, because Pentecostalism usually now when you hear about pneumatology, it's mostly about the supernatural stuff, healing and all of
Right.
that. But with Wesley, the pneumatological stuff is mostly ingrained in his soteriology.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that
Yes.
allows him to have much more optimism there in the possibility of the eradication of the sinful nature. But then you move on to the Keswick. The
Yes.
Keswick movement, it's much more of it's more of a middle way between
Yes.
the Wesleyan holiness understanding and the Reformed understanding of holiness. Because in the Reformed understanding, there's this understanding that the sinful nature cannot be overcome. It
Right.
cannot be eradicated. uh you know uh so there's
Or
a
even lessened, like it's
or
always
lesson,
going to be
yes.
present.
Yeah,
Even though you,
it's always present. Yeah,
even though
yeah,
your
yeah,
name is
yeah,
Luther and I have a
yes.
Luther bobblehead,
Yes, yeah,
it doesn't mean, yeah, exactly. Not
yeah.
simultaneously saint, simultaneously sinner, right?
Yes, and then they, at least for the Lutheran sense, there's this understanding that once you're justified, you're already fully sanctified,
Right. Right.
But then there's also that understanding of sanctification in their sense that you're not gonna that the sinful nature will never be overcome, at least in
Right.
the
Right.
Reformed sense. And but then but then the Catholic movement seems to be a middle way, a via media between that Reform understanding and the eradication understanding in the Wesleyan holiness sense. By agreeing, or by acknowledging that yes, sin cannot be totally eradicated, but it can be suppressed.
Right. Right. Right.
So the key word is not in the Wesleyan holiness, it's eradication. In the Catholic understanding, it's about suppression. It's like
Mm-hmm,
you're
mm-hmm.
suppressing. And one of the ways I explain the distinction is this illustration used by Bishop James Stolbarn. He was one of our early. He was actually the bishop who founded the Methodism in the Philippines. He was the
Okay.
amazing
Never
bishop
heard his name. Yeah.
from India. And he's a Methodist bishop, but he was more of a Keswick person.
Okay.
And he wrote a book, The Church of Pentecost. Imagine, he wrote this book, published it in 1899. He's a Methodist bishop, but he wrote a book on the Church on Pentecost, basically talking about holiness, but Keswick holiness.
Okay.
And then he cites an illustration there whereby he talks about a farmer having a conversation with another farmer about having weeds in his garden. He plants and then weeds turn up, and then the other farmer said, you know what, if you can actually eradicate those those
Yeah.
weeds, if you just
Pick up the
if you
root.
pick up the roots, just pull them out, uh and and they'll never come back, and I kind of like that. Basically, that kind of shows a Wesleyan holiness understanding. But then another guy showed up and said, "You know what? That's a bad illustration, my friend. Because if you pull them out, they're gonna come back again. You know." Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention the guy was talking about burning them. There you go, burning them, not pulling them
Oh,
out,
okay.
burning
Interesting.
them. Yeah, burning them. So that's the Wesleyan holiness understanding. But then the third guy comes, and this is the Catholic guy, and he said, that's a bad illustration, my friend. Yes, you burn them, but then they're still gonna come back. So but here's my proposition. What if you keep the fire burning? So that's the
Interesting.
suppression, So that's the Catholic understanding. So what you find in the Catholic movement is the language, the term commonly used is, the abiding life,
Okay.
abiding
Yeah.
in the spirit-filled life, to kind of indicate a much more of a, it's like an ongoing thing. It's to show that, by being connected to the Holy Spirit, that's the only way you can suppress the sinful nature from manifesting in your life. But then it will never disappear as long as you live. It will always be there. But in the Wesleyan sense, no, it will be eradicated. It will disappear. You will overcome it. So those are the distinction between Wesleyan holiness and Catholic. And then what about radical holiness? Radical holiness comes more from the Wesleyan stream, the Wesleyan holiness stream. But then they give a lot of emphasis on the eradication. They're what we call hyper eradicationists.
Okay.
They're the hyper eradicationists. And then you also add two main teachings to them. The belief in divine healing,
right,
and premillennialism.
Yes.
So that's the other factor. So
now, is that premillennialism in the radical holiness movement? Is that dispensational premillennialism, or is it more of a historic type of?
Yeah, it's more of a dispensationalism because it appeared at a time when dispensationalism appeared in the country, and so there were holiness folks who embraced that. That understanding of dispensationalism. Yes, they would have affirmed the rapture.
Yeah, interesting.
And it comes by in different degrees. In Morrison, I don't see a lot of that in his language, but he wrote a book on on the second coming. He wrote a book on the world's getting worse. Is the word getting better? The world's getting worse.
Yeah.
But then his conclusion was the world's getting worse. So that puts him in the premillennialist stream. And so his premillennialism, it's more about that. It's I guess a product of what happened after World War I, the Great War. A lot of evangelicals who used to be much more optimistic about the future became premillennialists because of they begin to see that the world was getting worse and worse. And then you did not look far because you have World War I going on. And I think that's where
Morrison founds Asbury, seminary in 1923. So exactly 100 years ago, from now. But that's a period of history. What's happening, like where we are in between World Wars I and World War II, and that dramatically affects what's happening. So that okay. So they had the radical holiness movement. Was like doubled down on the eradication language. So I was a little bit surprised to hear you say because even the Wesleyan holiness stream, not often thinking of them with that language of eradication. But when you said that the kind of radical holiness movement overemphasized that and premillennialism and healing. So go ahead.
And I think part of the doubling down was also the result of the immense popularity of Keswick. So they were reacting against Keswick because they're saying, "Oh wow, this is a direct affront." Actually, they call it Morrison called it a heresy, a Wesleyan heresy, the Keswick movement. You find that in my article. He calls it a heresy, and he kind of abhorred the fact that there were students at Asbury who hold to the suppressionist understanding.
Wow.
And he would say, in First John 1 verse 7, John did not say, the blood of Christ suppress all sin, but he said cleanse us from all sin, not suppress us from all sin. And so but again, I think it's part of that. It's a reaction against Catholic, and they're finding Catholic manifesting within Methodism itself. And so they tend to push back, and so that's why you get the hyper eradicationists in them.
So this connects to let me go ahead. We could go on for a long time.
Exactly.
I really appreciate these distinctions. So, but when we think of the world tour of evangelism, so Morrison comes and he brings this different perspective of the radical holiness movement. So let's see if we could tie up what happened. But it's not. I'm sorry to have to say tie it up because it's leading us to a place where a good thing happens that we'd like to see happen here as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because he encountered that particularly when he went to India. because by that time, and I wrote a paper on this also on the manifestations of the Holiness movement in the Methodist missions in India, and the conclusion I got was, my conclusion was they became more Keswick in India.
Interesting.
Yeah, because of their connection with other denominations, mostly, those coming from the Reformed side. And so the way that they were able to kind of unite with the different missions was embrace Keswick.
Right.
But
Interesting.
and then by the time Morrison arrived there in 1910 and does his thing, revival on the eradicationist, and people would start commenting. I would see, comments on like the Indian Witness. That's a paper they had in the Methodist Church in India, and what someone said, I've never saw someone preach about the of the possibility of entire sanctification,
Wow.
the eradication of the sinful nature. It was foreign to them, and this was the Methodist
Yeah.
Church. And so
Right.
I think that was the legacy of Morrison. He tried to bring that back. Uh,
Yes.
Among the Methodists, the more optimism on that understanding of the
It's amazing how
possibility.
this
Yeah.
happens over
Yes.
and over again.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
this the same like pattern keeps coming back and forth.
Yeah.
In my own denomination, there was
Mhm.
a period where we had clear eradication language that
Mhm.
was connected, and then it was taken out. And then
Yeah.
there's been waves where it's like, I don't know if you call it Keswick understanding, but
Mm.
close
Mm.
to it, and then kind of like
Yeah.
coming back and forth. And it's
Mhm.
interesting. One of the key leaders was a very good friend, like of Morrison, was
Mhm.
Samuel Logan Brengle,
Oh.
who was a
Mhm.
part of this same movement, and it came from the
Mm.
Salvation Army. So I
Yes.
always find it interesting, like the
Interesting.
way that they often get rediscovered. But
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
hopeful that like this message, of course, can be like
Mhm.
connected to our own sense of God's revival
Exactly.
work. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. For Morrison, he definitely was moving in the radical holiness stream, but he was more big on that eradication.
Mhm.
Uh, not so much on the healing. I never saw anything about him doing healing, talking about healing. Although you'll find accounts of that in the Pentecostal Herald from people writing to the editor and talking about their divine healing, experiencing
Interesting.
healing. So I guess he allowed them to be published there. But from him personally, reading his writings, at least during that period within during the world tour, I look at Pentecostal Herald 1910, 1909, 1910, 1911. I didn't see anything from him speaking about divine healing, but there's a lot of him talking about premillennialism, the second
Yes.
coming, but not during the tour. It was mostly about
Okay.
eradication.
Interesting.
Yeah, but you'll find a lot of premillennialism in him later on. Um, yeah, so I think he would be rightly be categorized within the radical holiness stream, but somehow managed to stay within mainstream Methodism at the
Yeah,
same
that's the
time. Yes,
fascinating thing,
yes,
is that he
yes,
still had that connection and was still
yes.
this
Mm-hmm.
Methodist-like figure
Yes,
throughout their
exactly.
and able
Because
to
it's
attract
yeah,
people.
yeah. Because his
He also
colleagues.
stood
Mhm.
against
Go ahead.
modernism, right? That was a big
Yes,
piece. Is
yes.
like
The big peaks. Yeah.
he wasn't also it wasn't he appealed to
Mm-hmm.
more than just a holiness movement.
Yeah.
Like his
Yeah.
appeal against modernism, his
Yeah.
premillennialism helped connect
Premillennialism.
him probably in a
Yes.
broader
Mm.
way.
In a broader way. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. He was able to operate within mainstream Methodism, but then had a lot of friends in the radical holiness stream.
Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
especially folks from God's Bible School, which not too far from Wilmore. God's
Yes,
Bible
yeah.
School was in Cincinnati, so because that's where OMS came from. The
Right, right.
Oriental Missionary Society, uh, and so he's kind of looked at as a friend in that movement.
For
And
sure.
it's interesting how I was able to do all of that. You know, uh, and I mean, he's really a fascinating figure. And I'm not, I'm not surprised why during his time he was able to kind of revive Asbury College, because
Right.
it was in a big mess at that time. financially, but he was able to kind of at least during his leadership, he was able to kind of lift up the school
Yes.
out of financial trouble.
Right.
And then later on, he was able to establish a seminary.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
both things, when both institutions, in
yeah,
my view, would not
mm,
exist without
yeah,
his leadership. Obviously, with seminary
exactly.
being founded,
Mm,
there's an interesting dissertation by Mike Longino, who's a
mm,
journalist, a journalism professor, but he looked at the way that um, um, Morrison was able to use the Pentecostal Herald to
mm,
unite a group and
yeah,
also to save the school financially.
exactly.
So I
Yeah,
think that's it was in part
yeah.
this brought. I think
Mm,
my little summary thought, and I'll let you give a closing thought then too, is like this pan-Wesleyan movement doesn't necessarily need to be connected to institutions.
yeah.
At the same time, there's something going on, but it does need a uniting
Hmm.
connection.
Yeah.
I know I don't want to take away from your emphasis of what was able to happen in this world tour, but it was this message that
Hmm.
was uniting as that
Exactly.
happened. So,
Exactly.
all
It
right,
was
I'll
it
let you
was a
give the
message. Yeah.
closing comment on that, and then I have one more
Yes.
question for you.
Yes. Yeah. Precisely. It's really the message. The message that he carried resonated with people. The message offered hope.
Yes.
The sin is a reality that people experience in their lives, and they want to get out of that reality, that sin. And Morrison offered a way,
Yes.
that made sense to them. And it resonated with people. It resonated with folks from the whole One Pan Western connection that were subscribing to his paper. Obviously they love what he was writing, what he was doing. Uh, he was a successful evangelist preaching. But at the same time, when he went when he went for his world tour, quote unquote, you know, the mess, just the same thing, the same uh welcoming, the way how his message was welcomed in the US. It was the same outpouring of support
Yes.
was
Yes.
manifested as well in those parts of the world. Not even, and I'm not just talking about American audiences. He preached to Filipino audiences, to Burmese,
Yes.
to Indians, international folks, because his accounts were full of amazing things happening at the altar, and mostly it's not, you have the admixture of Americans, Europeans there, particularly in India, but then for the most part, natives,
Yes.
or nationals responding to his message. So I think that's what the key to his success was. It's the message that he
Yes.
carried.
Love it.
And sometimes we tend to not recognize that. People tend to look at more at the on the outside things.
Physiological.
Yeah,
Yeah.
physiology and all of that. And I think that's one of the things that I did when I did my study, is to really recognize, if you're going to study people, if you're going to study missionaries or personalities, look at what they're teaching. Look at the content, the doctrinal
Yes.
content. Because more often or not, we ignore those. We ignore that, when
Yes.
we do studies on people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Well,
so,
that's great. Luther, thank you
right.
so much for your time
Mm,
here. Well, I
mm,
always ask people in connected to this idea, I say there's more
yes.
to the story because it's like
Yeah.
a theological concept, right?
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
there's more than
Mm,
just salvation. But
yeah.
is there also more to the story of Luther Oconer than most people know?
Oh,
Like what
yes.
was it? Yeah.
Yeah, just like Morrison, one of the things that attracted me to him, he was a revivalist, an evangelist,
Yeah.
and I too I would say a revivalist as well. I
Amen.
Part of the things that I do, and I not only teach in the seminary, I not only do R&D, research and development, so to speak, but I also, particularly in the past 6 years, 5 or 6 years, began finding myself more in the pulpit preaching, doing
Okay.
events, and also I started finding myself doing a lot of divine healing,
Okay.
divine healing workshops, not just in my preaching, but also because imagine when was this? Probably around 2016 and up. I increasingly found myself being invited uh, to do divine healing workshops in churches more than I was invited to do workshops on Methodism. Yeah, the divine healing part, aspect in my ministry outpaced that,
Yes. Oh,
and it
good.
seems churches, seem to seek me out more for that. At least prior to the pandemic, that was the case. Yeah, and so I really find this exciting because prior to entering the academy, the academe, I was a pastor. I was pastoring a church. I was a youth revivalist, and that's what got me in trouble, by the way. But way back then, as I was starting in the ministry, and then to find myself coming full circle, just about 5 to 6 years ago, and one of my highlights in my ministry was in 2016 when I was invited to the Philippines, in the United Church in the Philippines to be one of the preachers or to preach at the what they would call the Revive Conference that was in
Oh,
Manila,
wow.
and there were about 12,000 people there
Amazing.
in that stadium. And as I was standing there in front of those people, I was really terrified.
I'm
But at
sure.
the same time, I was kind of reminded, I reminded myself, you were just writing about revival, the history of revival in this country, of Methodism of revivalism, of the Holiness movement in the Philippines. And now here you are, you're doing a
Wow.
revival.
Wow.
And it's very humbling to think about that. It's
Yeah.
because I was kind of seeing myself more as a professor, as a
Right. Right.
academic, and then
Academic. Yeah.
suddenly been given that opportunity. So
Yeah.
I just thank God for that, where
Yeah.
I'm seeing myself now. Yeah.
Oh, I love,
Mhm.
when I left a local church through the
Mhm.
ministry of the Salvation
Mhm.
Army. And it
Mhm.
just been about a year since I did that.
Mhm.
And I entered
Mhm.
the academy myself,
Mhm.
and I wondered about that. And I just look back,
Mhm.
and I think I probably preached more this
Yeah.
past year than I did
Yes.
it when I was a local church pastor. So
Exactly.
it's amazing how God continues to keep these doors open for the way he wants to work
Yeah.
through us. And I'm so thankful,
Amen.
Luther, for
Amen.
how God's using you as your teaching, your scholarship, and your preaching, and for the way that you're open to Spirit's work. So thanks so much for coming
Praise
on the
God.
More to the Story podcast. It's a blessing to have you.
Thanks again, and thank you all. Thanks for having me. God bless.